And hello, everyone. How you doing? It's Dave Bondi, the United States Senate. You are taking a live look to the right of me, right there. That is Senator Bernie Sanders. The United States Senate is about to vote on foreign aid, money to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Billions of dollars will be going to those countries, and the Senate is expected to approve that vote in just a matter of minutes. Also, they are going to vote to possibly ban TikTok. Now, the vote would not be actually to ban TikTok. The vote would be to force the parent company of TikTok, ByteDance, to sell TikTok to an American company. And they would have 1 year to do so. They would have 1 year to sell TikTok, or else it would be banned. Like I said, billions of dollars are on the line that will be going to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan as well. But you're taking a live look right now. Let's listen in on the Senate floor.
Settlements in Gaza. The current intelligence minister, among others, openly talks of permanently displacing Palestinians from Gaza. Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who oversees the police, has long advocated for the forceful expulsion of Palestinians from the region. This is the current Israeli National Security Minister. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, responsible for much of the occupied West Bank, has likewise long expressed extreme racist views and has called for the expulsion of Palestinians from their lands. He has called for segregated hospital wards for Jews and Arabs because, quote, Arabs are my enemies, end quote. As a younger man, he was arrested by the Israeli authorities on suspicion of anti-Palestinian terrorism. That is the man who is the current Israeli finance minister. Mr. President, this is a significant part of...
Okay, once again, live coverage happening right now on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Tonight, they are expected to vote on a foreign aid package that will give money to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. That vote is expected to take place at any moment. $95 billion in foreign aid. So $95 billion. I have 96 on the screen. Let me adjust that. It's actually $96 billion. So it's $95 billion. I apologize. I was $1 billion off. So $1 billion or $95 billion in foreign aid will be going to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. They will also be voting tonight on whether to ban TikTok. Now, it would not be an outright ban immediately. What would happen would be they would give 1 year. They would give 1 year to the parent company ByteDance to sell TikTok. And if they don't, TikTok would then be banned in the United States. Let me take a look at some of your comments right now. I can put them up on the screen. Earl Davidson says that would be a hostile takeover of TikTok. Could be. Let me see what Chris has to say. Chris, no more funding other countries as we clearly cannot fund ourselves. Chuck, let me see what Chuck has to say here in the comments. Just print more. That makes sense. I hope you're joking about that, because obviously printing more money does not help. It makes things worse. Good evening, Ellen from Michigan. Good evening. Okay. What else? What other comments do you have, everybody? Let me know. Go ahead and share this video out with your friends and family. I want to give you a live look at what's happening right now. Let's listen in for a little bit.
Women and children, and took more than 230 captives, some of whom are still in captivity today. And as I have said many times and repeated a moment ago, Israel has the right to defend itself, but it does not have the right to go to war against the entire Palestinian people, including women and children. Mr. President, let's take a deep breath and listen to some of these facts. And no one disputes these facts. War is about 6.5 months old. More than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed and 77,000 have been wounded. 70%
That is
are women
Bernie
and
Sanders.
children.
Bernie Sanders continuing to talk on the United States House floor right there. Let me put up some of your comments on the screen. Roden Pamela, why are they passing things under the cover of night? No more funding, no more proxy wars. That's according to Roden Pamela. Earl Davidson, why doesn't it? Do you really think that printing money is a good thing? That just printing money randomly? Printing money, just randomly printing money causes inflation and makes things worse. Almost every economist you talk to will say that, and that is a fact. So, no, you cannot just print money, just randomly print money. Ellen, we need to worry about the U.S. and quit worrying about other countries right now, and no more money for Ukraine, says Ellen. So, those are just some of the comments we're seeing. I am going to keep this up live throughout the evening. That's our buddy Bernie Sanders over there talking. And once again, describing what's happening right now, the United States Senate is going to be voting any moment on a $95 billion foreign aid bill and a possible ban of TikTok. Money would be going to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. TikTok would be banned in 1 year if the owner of TikTok, ByteDance, does not sell the company, and then TikTok would be banned. Earl was talking about the war. Okay, Earl, I misunderstood. I apologize there. Oh, you're talking about the war. I gotcha. Okay. Roden, Sanders is wrong. Israel has the right to do anything they see fit to protect their country and people safe. That's according to Roden. Awakening You says Biden is only in charge of the money, and it shows. I like this where I can read your comments on the air and have all of you involved in all of this. Tony's keeping it real. Traitors and scumbags, all of them, according to Tony. You know what? This is why I like free speech. You're allowed to say what you want. And my job is kind of just to moderate along. As long as you are respectful to each other, you can say whatever you want, right? That's what America's all about. Okay, well, I am going to step away for just a little bit, and I'm going to turn this on live right now so we can listen. To what Bernie has to say. And once again, a vote could be happening at any moment. A vote could be happening on the Senate floor. I'm not sure how long Bernie's going to talk, but I'm going to turn this up. I'm going to step away. We're going to listen to this. I'll be back in just a little bit, everybody.
3.5 times the size of the state of Vermont. Roughly 1.7 million people, over 75% of the population, have been driven from their homes. It's not a community which has been forced to evacuate in order for a military action to take place. This is 3/4 of the population driven from their homes. Satellite data shows that 62% of the homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed, including 221,000 housing units that have been completely destroyed. A number of months ago in Vermont, we had a terrible flood, and dozens of houses were destroyed, and I saw the impact of what the destruction of dozens of houses in my small state meant. We're talking about 221,000 housing units that have been completely destroyed. But it's not just housing. Mr. President, Gaza's civilian infrastructure has been devastated. There is little or no electricity apart from generators or solar power. Most of the roads are badly damaged. More than half of the water and sanitation systems are out of commission. Clean water is severely limited, and sewage, raw sewage, is running through the streets, creating disease. But it's not just housing and civilian infrastructure. And this is quite unbelievable. But there is a reason, I think, for all of this. None of this is happening by accident. Mr. President, Israel has systematically destroyed the healthcare system in Gaza. We're not talking about an occasional accidental bomb that destroys a medical unit or a hospital. Those things happen. What we are talking about is the reality that 26 out of 37 hospitals are completely out of service. They have been bombed and attacked in all kinds of ways. The 11 hospitals that are remaining are partially functioning. but they are being overwhelmed by tens of thousands of trauma patients, and they are short on medical supplies. So you got 77,000 people who have been wounded, and you got almost all of the hospitals out of commission. And I met recently with a group of American and British doctors recently returned from Gaza, where they had gone, bravely risking their own lives, to try to help alleviate the terrible suffering taking place there. And it is difficult to relate the unspeakable things they witness. They saw thousands of patients, many young children, killed or maimed in Israeli bombings. They operated on little children already orphaned on dirty hospital floors. On many days, they had no morphine. On other days, no water or clean gloves. They knew that many victims, even if they survived the week, would die of infection without access to sanitary environments or antibiotics. They reported that the Israelis would not allow them to bring in wheelchairs or syringes, claiming they might have some military use. They witnessed Israeli forces systematically cutting off electricity, food, and water to hospitals, then abduct medical workers with no affiliation to Hamas. They reported that Israeli soldiers destroyed medical equipment like MRIs, oxygen tanks, and CT scanners for no apparent reason. These are American doctors who witnessed these things. Overall, 84% of health facilities have been damaged or destroyed, and more than 400 healthcare workers have been killed, an extraordinary number. But we're not just talking about housing being decimated. We're not just talking about physical infrastructure being decimated. We're not just talking about a healthcare system being decimated. Mr. President, Gaza is a young community. A lot of children live there, and their educational system has been destroyed. 56 schools have been bombed and completely destroyed, and 219 have been damaged. Schools. The last of Gaza's universities, I think they had 12 universities in Gaza, and the last one was demolished in January. Now, I'm not quite sure how fighting Hamas has anything to do with destroying universities, but it does lead to the fact that some 625,000 students in Gaza have today no access to education. Mr. President, just today, David Satterfield, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Gaza humanitarian crisis, said that the risk of famine throughout war-devastated Gaza, especially in the north, is quote unquote very high, and that more aid must reach those areas. He said, and I quote, "We have always stressed that we were in a man-made situation and it can only be addressed by political will and decisions," end of quote. So on top of the destruction of housing, infrastructure, healthcare, and education, we're now looking at mass starvation and malnutrition. The United Nations estimates that more than 1 million Palestinians, including hundreds of thousands of children, face starvation. Desperate Gazans have been scraping by for months, foraging for leaves or eating animal feed. At least 28 children have died of malnutrition and dehydration, and that is a number that came out several weeks ago. There's no reason to believe that the real number is not much, much higher. USAID Administrator Samantha Power said that famine was already present in northern Gaza. Without food, clean water, sanitation, or sufficient health care, hundreds of thousands of people are at severe risk of dehydration, infection, and easily preventable diseases. Yet, for months, thousands of trucks carrying life-saving food, medicine, and other supplies have sat just miles away from starving children. Got that? And I hope we all try to put that image in our minds. Starving children over here, trucks loaded with food on the other side of the border, unable to get through. And they were kept from entering Gaza by Israeli restrictions and a brutal war fought with little regard for civilians. But let us be clear, and I think this is the main point that I want to make this evening. This war stopped being about defending Israel and going to war against Hamas a long time ago. This is not any longer a war against the terrorist organization called Hamas. This is now a war that has everything to do with the destruction of the very fabric of Palestinian life. That is the goal of this war. It is impossible to look at these facts and not conclude that the Israeli government's policy has been to make Gaza uninhabitable. That's what some of their government leaders have wanted, and that is in fact what is happening. These are not accidents of war, mistakes. This is calculated policy. Indeed, this is what has been going on systematically over the last 6 months. These cruel actions are entirely consistent with the public statements of numerous Israeli senior officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. Mr. President, that brings us to the United States' role in this horrific war. Put simply, we are deeply complicit in what is happening. This is not an Israeli war. This is an Israeli-American war. Most of the bombs and most of the military equipment the Israeli government is using in Gaza is provided by the United States and subsidized by American taxpayers. The U.S. military is not dropping 2,000-pound bombs on civilian apartment buildings. The U.S. military is not doing that, but we are supplying those bombs. The United States of America is not blocking the borders and preventing food, water, and medical supplies from getting to desperate people. We are not doing that. But we have supplied billions of dollars to the Netanyahu government, which is doing just that. So this is not just an Israeli war, this is an American war as well. And yet, despite the massive financial and military support the United States has provided to Israel for many years, Netanyahu's extremist government has ignored urgent calls from the president and others to alter their military approach and to end this humanitarian disaster. In my view, the United States' unconditional financial and military support for Israel must end. And that is why I offered an amendment to this bill to do, in fact, what a majority of the American people want us to do, and that is no longer to provide military aid to the destructive Netanyahu government. Mr. President, I would have welcomed the chance to vote for the humanitarian aid provision in this bill. Terribly important that we start feeding people, not only in Gaza, but in Sudan and all over the world. It's an important provision. I want to support it. I believe very strongly that we should support Ukraine and help them end, defeat the imperialist ventures of Putin and the Russian army. But I'm not going to be able to do that because I'm going to stand with the American people today who oppose more money for Netanyahu. So let me conclude, Mr. President, by simply saying this. What we are doing today is very bad policy. We are aiding and abetting the destruction of the Palestinian people. What we are doing today is not what the American people want. And I say to my Democratic friends, it is absolutely not what Democrats. A lot of Republicans don't want us to continue that as well. But a strong majority of Democrats are saying enough with Netanyahu's war. You just can't give him another $10 billion for unfettered military aid. But I suppose in a little while, as things happen here in the Congress, we will ignore the needs of the American people. We will not pay attention to what they want. And then we are shocked, just shocked, that we have a 14% approval rating. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Washington.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin,
Mr. President, it has been no easy task to get us to this point. The world has been watching. The clock has been ticking. We are finally at the finish line, and I'm not
There
just
is no
glad,
sound
but
at times
relieved.
because
We
they
are finally
pause.
about
This
to
is not
pass a bill from
regular
the House
TV that you're
that,
watching,
as
everybody.
many of us have noted,
What you're
includes
watching is
every
what
pillar
happens on
of
the
the
floor of
package.
the United States Senate. So, a lot of you, when you watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC, they give commentary. I'm not going to give you commentary right now. I think that you deserve to hear what's going on and see what's going on without some reporter or without some commentator giving their opinion, because CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all of them, they will give their opinion. And I know you don't really care for the opinion of some commentator on television. So I just want you to listen to what's going on. And once again, for those of you who are just joining us, go ahead and share this video out. If you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or X, go ahead and share that video with everybody. That's okay, Deb. That's fine. We're talking about $95 billion in aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Also, they are expected to vote tonight on whether to ban TikTok in the United States. Now, it would not be an immediate ban. It would have ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, would have 1 year to sell TikTok to an American company. If they did not, then TikTok would no longer be allowed to be on servers in the United States and the App Store or the Google Play Store. So that's what's happening tonight. And I'm going to break it to you. It's expected that it is going to pass. The United States Senate will vote to approve all of this. It will then go to President Biden. And at that point, Biden said he will sign the legislation. He will sign the legislation, and it will all happen. So most likely this is a practice in futility. It's going to happen, and we're here along for the ride. I'm going to take in, so you can listen again. Let's take a live listen right here on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Let's listen in once again. I'm not sure who this is that's speaking.
Made certain at every step that this bill delivers badly needed humanitarian assistance for Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, and many other regions caught in conflict. So now we're at the finish line. Let's vote to stand by our allies, to say to dictators like Putin that they cannot invade sovereign democracies freely and unchecked, and that America will not ignore the humanity and the cries for help from civilians who are caught in the middle of conflict and crossfire, who we must protect. Tonight, Moscow and Beijing are watching closely to see whether we have the vision to recognize how these crises are related and the resolve to come together and respond forcefully to them. Our adversaries are cheering for dysfunction. Let's show them unity instead. Let's show them the strength of democracy. Let's vote yes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, the pending measure, the House message to accompany H.R. 815, contains an emergency designation on page 12, lines 3 through 6, and another emergency designation on page 12, lines 12 through 15. I therefore raise a point of order pursuant to Section 314E of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 against both of these designations.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, pursuant to Section 904 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and the waiver provisions of applicable budget resolutions, I move to waive all applicable sections of that act and applicable budget points of order for the purposes of the pending measure, and I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow. Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cornyn, Kramer, Durbin, Langford, Murray, Padilla, Schatz, Schumer, Smith, and Stabenow. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Lee, and Scott of Florida. Mr. Haggerty, no. Got it. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Schmidt, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Vance, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Butler, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Britt, no. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Ricketts? Aye. Mr. Tillis? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Grassley? No. Mr. Murphy, aye. Yeah. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. It's pretty weird.
On this vote, the yeas are 75, the nays are 20. On this vote, the yeas are 75, the nays are 20. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to and the point of order fails.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
do we have order? This is an extremely important day in the history of our country and of the free world. They're all watching, waiting to see what we would do. When Putin escalated his war against Ukraine, I told our colleagues that allies and adversaries alike would pay very close attention to America's response. When Iran-backed terrorists invaded the Jewish state on October 7th to slaughter innocent Israelis, I warned that the world would watch closely for signs that American leadership was actually weakening. For months, our friends have watched to see whether America still had the strength that won the Cold War or the resolve that has underpinned peace and prosperity literally for decades. Our enemies have tested whether the arsenal of democracy is, in fact, built to endure. Well, tonight, the Senate will send a clear message. History will record that even as allies and partners may have worried about the depth of our resolve, even as Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran grew more convinced that our influence had run its course, and even as loud voices here at home insisted on abandoning the responsibilities of leadership, America stepped up and the Senate held firm. It's time to reaffirm some basic truths. Alliances matter. Foreign nations' respect for American interests depends on our willingness to defend them. And the peace, prosperity, and security are not accidents. They're products of American leadership and American sacrifice. So the votes we're about to cast will be among the most consequential. But the difficult work of restoring and sustaining hard power, defense, industrial capacity, and global influence must continue beyond this supplemental. So I'll just say to my colleagues, we can wish for a world where the responsibilities of leadership don't fall on us, or we can act like we understand that they do. Tonight, as at so many moments in our history, idle calls for America to lower its guard ring hollow. None of us is absolved of our duty to see the world as it actually is. None of us is excused from our obligation to equip the United States to face down those who wish us harm. I've said it before, history settles every account. And I welcome the eyes of posterity on what the Senate does tonight.
Mr. President,
Party leader.
finally, tonight, after more than 6 months of hard work and many twists and turns in the road, America sends a message to the entire world. We will not turn our back on you. Tonight, we tell our allies, we stand with you. We tell our adversaries, don't mess with us. We tell the world, the United States will do everything to safeguard democracy and our way of life. This bill is one of the most consequential measures Congress has passed in years to protect America's security and the future, the very future of Western democracy. And after overcoming a lot of opposition, tonight Congress finishes the job. To our friends in Ukraine, to our friends in Israel, to our friends in the Indo-Pacific, and to innocent civilians caught in the midst of a war from Gaza to Sudan, America hears you. We will be there for you. And to the whole world, rest assured, America will never shrink from its responsibilities as a leader on the world stage. Today, tonight, we make Vladimir Putin regret the day he questioned American resolve. I thank President Biden for his unflinching leadership. I thank Speaker Johnson and Leader Jeffries for working together valiantly to pass this bill. I thank Chair Murray, Vice Chair Collins for their excellent work. And I particularly want to thank my caucus for standing firm. We were always united. You gave us strength to get this job done. I salute you. And particularly, I want to thank Leader McConnell. We worked on this bill arm in arm together, shoulder to shoulder. Without that kind of strong, bipartisan leadership, this difficult bill would never have passed. We now come to the end of a long, difficult, and Herculean effort. Our allies around the world have been watching Congress for the last 6 months and wondering the same thing. When it matters most, will America summon the strength to come together, overcome the centrifugal pull of partisanship, and meet the magnitude of this moment? Tonight, under the watchful eye of history, the Senate answers this question with a thunderous and resounding yes. Now for a little more good news. The Senate, for the information of senators, the Senate will not be in session Monday, April 29th. The next roll call vote will be at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, April 30th. Mr. President, I ask consent that all post-closure time be deemed expired.
Is there objection?
I ask
Without
consent.
objection.
I ask consent that the pending motion to concur with Amendment 1842 be withdrawn.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question occurs on the motion to concur. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. You're good.
Hey everyone, how you doing? I'm back now. How you doing? So, can everyone hear me okay? We've been live for an hour and a half now, and it looks like they're voting. Just know if any of you out there can hear me. Go ahead, type in the comments, let me know. Yeah. Let me just get an update on what is happening here. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. By the way, is there anyone watching right now who would like to support my independent journalism? I left my job in the mainstream media in order to go independent, and I need your help. I'm going to put a link on the screen right here. If you're able to help me, it's $5 a month. You can quit at any time, and you can get the first month free on my Locals community. Locals is an independent journalism site, just like Facebook, but there's no censorship and no algorithm. It's really, really cool place. I'm going to put the link on the screen right now, or in the comments. If you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, I put the link in the comments right there. Sorry, my mic was muted. This is the final vote that they're taking right now on the legislation. They are going to be voting, or if they already did, on $95 billion going to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, and also banning TikTok. What could be the eventual ban on TikTok. No guarantees that that's going to happen, but it's a possibility that it could happen. So anyway, that's what
Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman.
Let's listen in.
Mr. Braun, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Cappuccio, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Britt, Brown, Butler, Cantwell, Capito, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Fetterman, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, Kennedy, King, Klobuchar, Manchin, Markey, McConnell, Menendez, Moran, Mullen, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Ricketts, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, Young. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Barrasso, Blackburn, Braun, Budd, Haggerty, Johnson, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Merkley, Rubio, Sanders, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Vance, Welch. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye.
Okay, it just became official. The United States Senate has voted to ban TikTok if the U.S. Senate approves a bill banning TikTok in the U.S. if ByteDance refuses to divest. So it will now go to President Biden for his signature, and it will be official. It will be official. So and the money to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan is also happening. So that's going to President Biden. President Biden said he is most likely going to sign it, and that's where we are. I'm going to let you go, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Appreciate you being here, and thank you so much.